Chapter 1. A New Home. About 30 years before our story begins, Miss Maria Ward, a young lady with only about £7,000 of her own, was lucky enough to catch the eye of a rich baronet. He was Sir Thomas Bertram of Mansfield Park, a large country house in Northamptonshire, about 80 miles north of London. He fell in love with her and married her, and she became Lady Bertram, with a fine house and plenty of money. However, her two sisters, although pretty, did not manage to find husbands as good as hers. Sadly, there are more lovely women in the world than rich men to marry them. Her older sister married a poor clergyman, Mr. Norris. Sir Thomas kindly offered Mr. Norris the living of Mansfield, so Mr. and Mrs. Norris began their married life at the parsonage, near the great house. The younger sister, Frances, chose an even worse husband, a young officer in the Navy, and because she knew her sisters would not accept him in the family, she did not tell them until after her wedding. Lady Bertram, who preferred a quiet life, was too lazy to do anything much about it. But Mrs. Norris could not rest until she had written a long letter to Frances, now Mrs. Price, to tell her how stupid she had been. Mrs. Price wrote back angrily, saying bitter things about Mrs. Norris, Lady Bertram, and Sir Thomas, and his unnecessarily high opinion of himself. Mrs. Norris felt unable to keep this reply to herself.
How could Frances say those terrible things about you and dear Sir Thomas?
She said sadly to Lady Bertram.
I knew her letter would make you both unhappy, but I felt it was my duty to inform you of it.
And from then on, there was a cold silence for some years between Lady Bertram and Mrs. Price, who lived many miles away and moved in very different social circles. However, interestingly, Mrs. Norris continued to hear from her younger sister, and almost every year she told the Bertrams in an angry voice,
Really, it's too bad of her. Frances has had another child.
By the end of 11 years, Mrs. Price had a large family of 8 children, and would soon have a 9th. It seemed her husband was well enough to go drinking with his friends, but couldn't earn enough money to keep his family, and they were very poor. Now, Mrs. Price was sorry that she had cut herself off from her sisters, so she wrote a letter to Lady Bertram asking for help. Sir Thomas and Lady Bertram were happy to reply. They sent money and baby clothes. Often Mrs. Norris said to Sir Thomas and Lady Bertram, when she visited them in the evenings,
I wish we could do more for my poor sister. She has so many children, poor thing.
And soon she had an idea.
Her oldest daughter is a girl of 9 or so. Why shouldn't we, the 3 of us, offer to take care of her? She could live with us at Mansfield. That would be a great help to poor Frances.
Lady Bertram agreed at once, but Sir Thomas said seriously,
If we take her away from her family, we must take care of her well, and that will cost quite a lot of money. And there are my sons to think of. I wouldn't want them to fall in love with the girl.
Mrs. Norris did not wait for him to finish.
My dear Sir Thomas, I do understand you. Always so ready to think of other people. I completely agree with you. It may be expensive, But as I have no children of my own, I'll be only too pleased to help. And, you know, your sons will see her as their sister, so there'll be no danger there. Of course, I'll never love her as I love your own dear, dear children. But, after all, she is my poor sister's child, and I feel I must help her as long as I have a bit of bread to give her.
So it was agreed, and Mrs. Norris wrote to Mrs. Price, who accepted the offer. Sir Thomas was ready to pay for it all, while Mrs. Norris, who talked so often about how kind and generous she was hoping to pay nothing. Her love of money was as great as her love of managing people, and she found saving her own money as easy as spending other people's. The day before the little girl, whose name was Fanny Price, was expected to arrive, Sir Thomas was surprised to learn that Mrs. Norris was unable to take the girl at the parsonage.
Poor Mr. Norris is so ill at the moment,
she said, shaking her head sadly,
that I'm very much afraid a child's noise would be bad for him. Of course, when he gets better, if he gets better, I'll be happy to take care of her.
So it was decided that Fanny Price would live at Mansfield Park, with her aunt and uncle, their 2 sons and 2 daughters. The sons, Edmund and Tom, were tall, good-looking young men of 16 and 17, while the daughters, Maria and Julia, were beautiful, well-grown girls, only a year or 2 older than Fanny. They all had their own opinions, liked talking, and were much more sure of themselves than little Fanny. From the moment she arrived at the great house, so different from her parents' small one, she was afraid of everybody, ashamed of herself, and very unhappy. She missed her family, and could not say a word without crying. But she spoke so little that nobody noticed how miserable she was. Then one day, Edmund, the younger son, found her sitting crying on the stairs.
My dear little cousin,
he said gently.
What can be the matter? Are you ill? How can I help you?
Nothing. No, thank you. It's very good of you all to have me here.
She whispered, still crying.
You miss your family, I'm sure.
He said, smiling.
Yes, I do. But most of all, my brother William. He's the oldest in my family, you know, and my greatest friend. It's so hard to be away from him.
And poor little Fanny started crying all over again.
He'll write to you, I'm sure,
said Edmund kindly.
Yes, he promised to, but he told me to write first.
And when will you do that?
She looked away from him and said unhappily,
I don't know. I don't have any paper.
If that's the only problem, I can give you paper. Would it make you happy to write to William?
Yes, very.
Well then, come with me to the breakfast room.
He sat her down at a desk and found some paper and stayed with her while she wrote her letter. With his own hand, he generously added his love to his cousin William, which pleased Fanny even more, and then he called a servant to take it to the post. From this day on, Edmund's continued kindness to Fanny made her feel happier. The place became less strange to her, and the people there less frightening. She learnt to play with Maria and Julia, to read and talk to Edmund, and not to mind Aunt Norris too much. Mansfield Park became her home, and Edmund became her favourite person there. She loved him better than anybody in the world, except her older brother William. But would her happiness last?